Thank you very much for the warm welcome, and I was told that I would speak to an intimate crowd, which we guess we are, and that I would speak in a warmer environment, which obviously I'm not. But nevertheless, I took the journey here from sunny Miami, warm Miami, to New York because it's important for me and to speak at a group who dedicated itself so much to not only to keep the memory of the Holocaust alive, but to learn from the Holocaust. And for me, this is a personal story, as you heard, because not being a son of a survivor, but a son of a perpetrator, is a heavy burden. And with that burden, I had to grow up. And growing up in Germany, I was, of course, not aware about what was awaiting me in my life. Born in 1958 in a beautiful town in Germany called Bamberg, which is a historic city nestled between Würzburg and Nuremberg in the south of Germany. A city full of history, untouched by wars, is 1,000 years old. We were made aware as children that history is alive, that history is part of us, that history we need to learn from. But as a child, I learned very early on that certain aspects of history the adults would not talk about. The recent history. And the recent history was very much present. Because I knew as a child already, 7, 8 years old, that there was a war. That there was a war which Germany lost. And it was evident that Germany lost that war because there were more than, in our town at least, 15,000 American soldiers and family members living in a city of 75,000. This was a presence that one could not deny or overlook. And when I asked my parents about that war, they were very tight-lipped. I should not know anything about it. The past is past, we moved on. But slowly but surely, my father started to talk about that war. Proudly, though, telling me stories about the war as the best time of his life, in which he served as a tank commander, one of the youngest tank commander, under the command of General Guderian, the father of the German Blitzkrieg, and battled on every war front that Germany opened in the war. The elite units that invaded Poland on September the 1st, 1939, then France in the summer of 1940, and following the Soviet attack on the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941. And that's what he told me about that war, is the knight in shining armor story. The man on the tank, the officer on the tank, a young officer storming forward, conquering foreign country. And for me as a child, this was, of course, a almost mythic story, a story that I identified myself with, and I looked up to my father as a hero, specifically knowing that my father was awarded the Knight's Cross by a man whom he adoringly referred to as his Führer, Adolf Hitler. And this Knight's Cross he showed to me repeatedly. He showed it to me and wanted me to be aware that his father was a hero. And this message was reinforced by his old war buddies, who came to visit our house at least once a year to celebrate the good old times. That's the way they referred to the war. My mother told me a completely different story about that war. The war's horror is catastrophe, the war that led to the loss of everything that was dear to her. She was an ethnic German, a Sudeten German, growing up in the territory of the former Czechoslovakia, in which ethnic Germans lived for hundreds of years. And as a result of the war, she had to flee. Her parents were evicted, lost everything. A beautiful villa, a flourishing business. And so for her, the war was a catastrophe. So two stories formed in my mind. The war is glory, the war is horror. But very early on, I learned that there was something else about that war. And it had to do with our house. Growing up in a house in this large two-story massive building in downtown Bamberg, there was something unique about that house. The entire second floor was occupied by a lady that my mother referred to as the landlady, and I should only talk to her when spoken to. And she was a countess, my mother said. And in the hallway of this building was a portrait of someone that I didn't know who that was, hanging on the wall right next to the wooden stairway leading upstairs to her apartment. And it depicted an officer in uniform, like I saw pictures of my father at home, with officer's insignia, the officer's cap, and the cross around his neck. When I asked my father who this man was, my father referred to him as a traitor. Now, I knew as a child that a traitor is a bad word, but how can a man who looked like my father be bad, and my father who looked like him be good? Naive question of a child. And later I had to reconcile these two worlds when I learned that the man who was depicted on the portrait was no other than Count Klaus von Stauffenberg, the German colonel who was leading the assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler on the 20th of July 1944, And the widow, the lady upstairs, was his widow, Nina von Stauffenberg. And from her, I later learned the story about her husband, and that there was another Germany of people that looked like my father but did something very different, that followed the moral compass and acted. And my father didn't. And I asked myself why. And this question, why and what happened, surfaced almost brutally in the summer of 1972, that we as young Germans had to deal with it. In the summer of 1972, the Olympics in Munich, Germany. And you ask yourself, what is the correlation between the Olympics in Munich in 1972 and the past and the dealing with it? Well, there was first of all the fact that the Olympics in Germany in 1972 were supposedly the event that should demonstrate to the world that this is a different Germany, not the Germany of 1936 that Adolf Hitler abused for propaganda purposes. And these Olympics were opened by a chancellor or a prime minister who himself was a victim of the Nazis. His name was Willy Brandt, who was elected in 1969. And he wanted to make sure that Germany should not only not forget the past, but should deal with the past. He was the first post-war German politician who in December 1970 traveled to Poland and in front of the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial sank on his knees, bowed his head, and asked for forgiveness for the sins that Germany committed. And I remember that day, I was 12 years old, because my father slammed a newspaper on the breakfast table with the headline and a picture of the chancellor on the front page. And he yelled and screamed, with red-faced, that another traitor was among us. Wieder ein Verräter, again a traitor, because there was nothing to forgive for my father at least. And this chancellor, with this tremendous moral standing in the Western world, opened the Olympics to a great fanfare. And I remember this day, we were sitting at home in the front of the TV. My father invited friends over. And after the chancellor opened the Olympics, all the teams paraded into the stadium. And one of the teams paraded into the stadium carried a flag with a star inside. Now, at that moment, nobody talked in the room, as if a ghost appeared on the screen. For me, as a 14-year-old young man, that was a team. I learned that this is a flag of the state of Israel. It didn't mean anything for me. It was a flag of another state. But the reaction of my parents was so funny, and I heard about the history at that point in time. It was not omitted. We learned about it in school, that during the Second World War, which the Nazis triggered, in which 80 million people perished, among them were 6 million Jews. But it was conveyed to us as part of collateral damage of war, not the uniqueness that we later had to deal with. And then 10 days later, the same team that so proudly paraded into the stadium was brutally attacked by a group of Palestinian terrorists. Those of you who remember, the Israelis were taken hostage by a group of Palestinian terrorists in the Olympic Village. The Olympics came to a halt. The German government dispatched highest-ranking government officials to the Olympic Village to negotiate face-to-face with the terrorist leaders. A deal was struck to fly out the hostages with the terrorists to a military airport outside Munich called Fürstenfeldbruck. And unfortunately there, in a botched rescue attempt, all the Israelis were killed. The terrorists, immediately when the firefight started that the German police triggered, killed all the Israelis by hand grenades and by machine gun fire. And the next day in the newspaper there was this picture that changed the direction of my life, actually the reason why I'm standing here. 2 helicopters depicted on the picture on the tarmac, one burned out, the other with the bodies of the Israelis slumped forward over the seat. A big headline, Jews killed in Germany again. And I asked myself, what does that mean? So whom to ask? My father. And I asked my father, what does it mean, Father? And he replied, it means nothing. It's over with them. We're done with them in our house. We don't talk about them. And I was atypical, because he normally would literally involve me in discussions about current affairs and politics to instill my curiosity and foster my knowledge. And here he didn't talk. And in school we started to talk about it, not only about the past as it was conveyed to us before, but about the Holocaust. The murder, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, 1 out of every 3rd Jew in Europe, as government policy, by an elected government, as policy of the country of Germany, as the people of Germany represented by its government. And I was shocked. I never heard about it. Now, not only was I shocked, I asked myself the question, what did my father do, the war hero who battled on every war front, the knight in shining armor? And so when I went home, I asked him, Father, can you tell me about the Holocaust? And he looked at me, Bernd, your teachers are communists. The Holocaust is a lie, it never happened. Don't listen to them. Now here I was caught between the rock and a hard place, wanting to believe my father, whom I respected still, but trusting and believing my teachers too. And here I started to learn as much as I could about the past. Not through a Holocaust center, because there was none to learn from, but going into the library. And in the library I learned and read everything that formed my mind and shocked me so much. And I decided to ask my father and find out what happened, because I had a growing suspicion that he knew more than he wanted to tell me. And finally, my father, over a series of several conversations that we had over several years, he came out with the truth, first from denial, that he didn't know anything, because the Wehrmacht didn't do anything. He was not SS, he was Wehrmacht, which was a blatant lie. The Wehrmacht was so much involved in the killing of the Jews that ranking officers protested and demanded to halt this campaign. Then to the defending the fact that what happened in the East was a campaign against partisans, i.e. the rules of war don't apply to any combatants, which are immediately questioned because I learned about the murder of more than 1 million children, and I could not unbelieve him telling me this story. And then finally admitted that he knew about the Holocaust, but it had to be done in the name of racial purity, to get rid of the riffraff in the East. And then that was the last straw that broke the camel's back, so to say. I didn't trust my father anymore. I turned away from him in disgust. He was not the man I could trust, not the man I could look up to, not the man whose values I could follow. And I started to ask myself the question, why the Jews? Why did Germans in Germany kill Jews? Because I had no idea who Jews were, no idea what Judaism was. And I started a journey, a spiritual journey, a physical journey to explore Judaism, to explore Israel, which led me to Israel. By meeting young Israelis in Germany and being invited by them to visit them. And through their eyes, I saw and experienced Israel, specifically through the eyes of their parents. Some of them were Holocaust survivors. And finally, I landed, so to say, in Yad Vashem several years later. And in Yad Vashem, it opened my eyes, the Holocaust Memorial in Yerushalayim. That 6 million is not a number, but 6 million are 1 + 1 + 1. Individuals murdered in the name of hatred. Hatred that my father still harbored deep in his heart. And I asked myself, why the Jews? And not only why the Jews, but how can the Jews continue living, building their lives, rebuilding their families, rebuilding an old country? Where do they take the strength from? Who are they? And this curiosity in Jews and Judaism led me on my return to Germany to explore Judaism by approaching a Jewish community in my hometown, a small Jewish community, about 30 members, all Holocaust survivors, all were Polish Jews, none of them were from Germany. They just settled in Germany after staying in displaced person camps after the war. And the chair of the Jewish community, his name was Itzhak Rosenberg, accepted me as a Shabbos Goy, which I don't have to explain you what that is. I didn't know what that is. And so I became a Shabbos Goy of a small Jewish Orthodox community and grew into this community as a family of choice. Week by week, holiday by holiday, month by month, I participated in their activities literally by absorption, by osmosis. And slowly but surely, over the course of the years, I grew into this community of this family of choice, growing apart from my family of origin. And finally, came to the point where I felt more comfortable and more at home in this spiritual world than in the world that I was coming from which I was pushed away also because my parents and my father specifically demanded that I should make a decision where I want to belong to. And 5 years into this journey, I approached the chair of the Jewish community and asked him that I wanted to convert, which he strongly discouraged by showing me his number tattooed on his forearm and saying that this is all what you get as a Jew, is suffering, and I shouldn't do it. But he sent me to a rabbi in Frankfurt to talk me out of it, which he almost successfully did. But he took me under his wings, under his spiritual wings, so to say, and I learned over the next following 2 years I got a formal education in Judaism, and in the fall of 1986, I underwent a formal Orthodox conversion. And that was followed by my decision that I had to leave Germany. I could not stay in Germany anymore. And in January 1987, I made Aliyah. And within 60 days, actually, after I received my conversion certificate, I made Aliyah and arrived in Israel without family, alone, not knowing anything about the language, its people, nobody, and joined the kibbutz. After 6 months, finally learning some Hebrew, I was assigned to a hospital by the Jewish agency and the absorption ministry, where I absolved all the necessary courses that I had to undergo in order to obtain my Israeli license. And then was drafted immediately in the military because I accepted Israeli citizenship on my arrival. And in the military, after 6 months in the military and then joining the officers' course, it hit me hard. Because I remember that moment standing there in front of the Israeli flag after the officers' ceremony, the graduation ceremony, so to say, having my lieutenant wings on the shoulder, and I asking myself, if they find out who I am in uniform, that I'm my father's son, a son of a Nazi, I will be in big trouble. Nobody ever will believe me. Nobody ever will follow me. Nobody ever I can command because I'm a fraud. Yes, I was proud to be a Jew, but I was ashamed to be my father's son. And I concealed that fact from anybody, including friends, my wife, their family. I concealed my past. I literally threw my past in a closet and tried throwing away the key. And that was, of course, a bad idea. Because years later, when we were living in the United States, where I underwent my specialty training, my son, who is now 24, asked me a simple question. He was 14 years old, 10 years ago. He asked me a simple question. His name is Tal. Dad, who is my grandfather? And at that point in time, I had to make a decision. If I want to live in the closet or if I want to come out of the closet. And I told him that, what happened. And his reaction as a nice 14-year-old Jewish boy growing up in the United States attending Jewish schools, he said, "That's a cool story, Dad. Let me share it with everybody." Now, I had to tell him to hold the horses because I was fully aware that there would be complications by that sharing, and that actually it happened without me knowing, and I was not there at that time. He shared this story during a family history class in this Jewish school. I was told that he raised his hand, and when this question came, what did your grandfather or grandparents do? He blurted out, "Yeah, my grandfather was a famous Nazi." Now, that led, of course, to an immediate conversation with the principal and the rabbi, who thought that my son lost his marbles. And I remember that conversation. And the principal asked me, "Can you explain what happened?" And I told him it's not my son's fault. And I told him the story. And the rabbi looked at me and said, "You have to share this story." He was very serious. I said, "I can't. I never did." He said, "You should. Because it's good for the neshama, for your soul, and it's good for us." And so I shared the story for the first time in my son's school. And I knew that it was the right thing to do immediately after I shared. Because the weight was lifted off my shoulders. I had nothing to fear. There was no more shame. But there was only one question left. What happened? Why did I never close the circle of life that I opened so many years ago? And I never dared to close. I had to go back home. Home was Germany. And after almost 20 years, I took my son and I visited my parents at the only place I knew I could visit them, the cemetery. And ironically or tellingly, I found their grave located almost 2 to 3 rows parallel to the wall that separates the Jewish from the Christian cemetery. Even today, it's kind of eerie when you visit my parents' grave. You can find it in the cemetery in Bamberg. And there, standing in front of my parents' grave, I was speechless. I didn't know what to say. So I told my son, the only thing what I can tell you that it's a telling sign that your grandparents, my parents, are buried in the shadow of history. Because they never escaped the shadow of history. They never were able to step out of that shadow. So even in death, they live in the shadow. It's a powerful shadow that we, as those who are alive and living, can step out of. We can make a choice. We can face history, and learn from history and move out of the shadow and move forward and build a better world, or we are condemned to live in the shadow and repeating its mistakes. So it's move forward. Building a better world. Building a world that is not dominated by hate. Making this tikkun olam as Jews a reality, repairing the world. And this is the reason why I'm telling my story. It's not about me. I hope there were others like me who made similar decisions in different circumstances, not necessarily becoming Jewish, but making other decisions, good decisions, and being better people. And specifically at an evening like that, and the evening like today, we're talking about the Holocaust not only as something what happened in the past, as a memorizing the effect of the Holocaust, but looking forward what we can learn from it. It is important that we learn from it. What I learned from it is that hatred is not an abstract thought. Hatred comes from us. Each of us has the capacity to hate. These are very primal fears, very primal cognitive processes that we have, each of us is harboring. We all have the potential to hate. And it starts with words. Words of hatred that are left unchallenged. If these words of hatred fall on fertile ground, i.e. the human mind, they plant seeds, and these seeds will grow into deeds. And if these deeds left unchallenged, habits will form. And if these habits were left unchallenged, characters will be reinforced that promote those habits. And if these characters will create social norms, then it explains, but not excuses, that entire people look away. Because even today, until today even, people ask me how it can be that the Germans, the most educated people at that time, the sophisticated society, technologically oriented society, characterized by science and Nobel Prize winners, how could they have done it? Why did they do that? Well, because these words of hatred deeply were rooted in society and grew into social norms. It doesn't have to happen like that, but it unfortunately happens over and over and over again. And that's not by minimizing the Holocaust at all, the eclipse of hatred. But unfortunately, similar events happened after the war too. Remind you of Cambodia, the killing fields of the Khmer Rouge in the 1970s, where more than 1 million people were murdered in the name of a Stone Age capitalism ideology. Or in Rwanda in the early 90s, where Hutsis slaughtered Tutsis, 800,000, counting, with machetes for nothing else but ethnic hatred. Or in the center of Europe, in Bosnia and Serbia, where Serbs murdered Muslims, herded them into concentration camps, starved them to death, in the center of Europe, in the heart of Europe. Why does it happen again? And why does it happen? Because we don't learn from the past. We have to learn that stereotypes and biases can lead to hatred. They can lead to hatred, they don't have to, but they form the basis. And we have to be aware that in us, we have the cognitive capability to hate, to separate the world in good and bad, in those that we like and those that we don't like. A pattern recognition that served us very well in our evolution, but is a maladaptive behavior in our current complex modern society. And we have to educate people and educate coming generations how not to hate, but doing the opposite. By collaborate, accepting multiculturalism, be living together and learning from each other. And that's what Holocaust education is, to create a better world by creating and educating this generation today to live together, to live in the 21st century a different life than we lived in the centuries before. And if you achieve that with your work, then you achieved something very significant by going from door to door, from person to person. And hopefully, against all odds, change is possible in this world. Thank you very much.